So I guess we should get started.
Let's
All
go.
right. Awesome. All right. So good afternoon or good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Zuly Mamat. And with me today here is Dr. Nechama Liss-Levinson. And tonight we have been invited by the Uyghur Wellness Initiative onto the Uyghur Human Rights Project's platform to talk about a topic that concerns truly not really all Uyghurs only, but all of human beings, all humanity, and that is grief and loss. So I'll just quickly introduce myself and I'll let Dr. Nechama introduce herself. So I am a postdoc currently in memory and trauma work, and I specifically work with veterans, and my PhD was focused on helping people essentially learn how to control their thoughts. And I'm trying to apply that to the clinical realm now. I also have background in Islamic psychology. I'm also training in ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy at the moment. And so there are a bit of background here and there, but I'm really just here to be interested and to really learn more about this topic myself and to have a conversation with Dr. Nechama. So please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you, Zuly. It's such a pleasure to be here this evening with you, and I'm really looking forward to dialoguing with you. I am a psychologist for almost 5 decades, actually, and I've worked mainly with adults and sometimes with families. Perhaps my favorite is working with couples, but also with adults and their adult children. I find that really interesting work to do. And over the time, I've dealt with many issues, but one that has come up over and over again is dealing with loss and grief, and how loss and grief affects people's lives, and that being able to move through loss and grief helps people to live richer, more meaningful lives as they go forward. I've written several books and several papers on milestones in people's lives, and I've written several books for children on coping with death, including specifically the death of grandparents. I should say one other thing, which of course is most important for this evening, is that for the past 7 years, I've also been a volunteer with the Uyghur Wellness Initiative. And through this initiative, I've worked with several Uyghur individuals and couples who are dealing with different issues, particularly being here in the diaspora in the United States, dealing with many issues separated from their families and their loved ones who are back in China. And it's been a tremendous learning experience for me, and I hope helpful for the many people who I've been working with.
First of all, just on behalf of all of us, all of the Uyghur people, I really do thank you for the work that you do for us and for the community. It's really a blessing to have people like you to be helping the community overcome, or rather to be a part of that healing journey, which we're going to talk about today. So. It's an honor to speak with you. Let's just open with this idea of understanding loss and grief. So can you tell us a little bit about how do we understand these concepts? What does it look like in your own experience as a clinician? How does it manifest in the community, in people who are going through this process, and how to the level of their awareness even of this concept on itself, in its own.
Okay, thank you, Zuly. Grief is the experience of dealing with loss. And most of us think of loss as, oh, somebody died. God forbid, somebody dies. However, death, which is a kind of loss, is also one kind of loss, but there's many. Loss also could be end of relationships, separation from family, from friends, separation from your home, from your religion, from your job, from your health, from your language and culture. There's all kinds of separation from your dreams, separation from how you thought life might be. And in all these areas, there is loss. And one of the things is, how do we deal with this loss? Fortunately, there are many ways that we can. And it's important to understand that everyone deals with grief and loss differently. There's not one right way to do it or one amount of time that's right. People often say, I've been grieving being separated from my parents. How long will this go on? How long?
Mm.
Long will I have to feel this way? And there's not one right time. Everyone is different. And I think the other thing is that grieving is part of a journey. It's not something that happens and then it's over. For example, in terms of death, death is not just an end point. Death is part of the cycle of life, part of what's going on. And when somebody, for example, does die, often we feel a big hole in our heart. And over time, that hole may get smaller and smaller, but often that hole remains there. And part of going through life is living with that hole, but still going forward. I think what's important is that in dealing with the Uyghur community, I noticed that there were a number of things that make dealing with loss a little more complex and a little different. One of the things is that often this is an ongoing trauma. It's not over.
Right.
So when there's, let's say, a war, there's a war and then the war is over, or there's different things where something is over. But the trauma for the Uyghur people is ongoing. We're in the middle of it. And so dealing with grief and loss when we're in the middle of something is very, very hard to process because it's ongoing, it's not over. Secondly, there's a lack of information and contact, so that people who might be grieving the loss of, whether it's through contact with family members, because they often are not, you're not often allowed to speak to, or people there don't want to speak to you, you don't really know what's going on. And so it's hard to grieve when you don't know, are they okay or not okay? Are people sick or are they well? What's going on? And not knowing makes it harder to process the grief. And then thirdly, I think the issue that makes it hard is the whole issue. It's a kind of double issue. One is not knowing if what I do here will be helpful or not helpful to the people back in China. Will this be a good thing that I'm doing or not a good thing?
Right.
It makes this very complicated and confusing. And then finally, the whole issue of transnational repression, that even here, the Chinese government may be bothering people, terrorizing people, making it difficult for you to process the kind of grief that you might otherwise be able to go through.
Yes, and I think you've hit the nail right on the head, especially when you were mentioning this concept of ongoing trauma. And one of the things I think that I've noticed in the community is that what that means is that people don't have this even sense of like, oh, I now need to deal with this, right? It's like every day is the same. Like you're kind of moving forward, or at least you're living, obviously, but in a way of not actually being aware of the gravity of what this is doing to your psyche, or to your physical body, to your psychology, until it gets really bad, and you see that in manifestation. So I was wondering how you how does someone then become aware? Like, what are some repercussions of neglecting the symptoms of grief? What are some symptoms of grief?
Thank you for asking. I think the symptoms of grief, some of them we think about, are people being sad, perhaps crying, thinking about the loss, what the loss is, yearning, wishing that things were different, perhaps at times guilt. But there's other symptoms that I'm not sure people think of as having to do with grief. Some are emotional ones, a sense of confusion, maybe trouble making decisions, feeling lost or again, confused, maybe lacking motivation, unable to do the usual things you do, whether at home, with your children, on your job, just not feeling right. And then there's something where when we don't deal with some of the feelings of loss and sadness, these feelings also go into our body. There's a book called The Body Keeps the Score, where they go into our body, and grief can show up as nausea, headaches, an upset stomach, not sleeping, feeling heart palpitations, eating too much, not wanting to eat. And sometimes I've noticed, particularly with some of the Uyghur clients that I've spoken to, there's not necessarily from the Uyghur culture an idea of connecting some of these symptoms, let's say not sleeping, nightmares, stomach not feeling well, that these are all symptoms of grief, or of grief that hasn't really been worked through.
Yeah, you're mentioning a very interesting point, this somatic, right? This bodily, and you know, my background, when we talk about an Islamic understanding of the human being, we talk about these things, which is that your psychology, which is you can think of it as your mental health, your mental well-being, your physical body, right, as well as your soul, and your spirit. These are 4 different components. All of these are interconnected. So if one thing, you know, if for example, a disconnection with your body can result in a disconnection with, for example, with God, right? And your relationship with God can impact your physical symptoms. Same thing, psychological stress can create these physical sensations. And with this last point that you mentioned about Uyghur culture, you know, it's very interesting because there's actually a couple of my colleagues and friends, they're right now working towards this initiative of bringing back that traditional medicine that we had. We call it, like, it's part of Tib medicine, which is also like, you know, Islamic medicine as well. But it's a traditional Uyghur medicine that really, really focused on the intelligence of the human body. And so we've lost a lot of that because of the oppression, because of cultural erasure. But I think that there's a lot of wisdom in traditional medicine that we, you know, even the things that we eat and the types of, you know, the air that we breathe. And we'll talk about treatments and things like this, you know, that are kind of alternative forms in our conversation today. But I think that's very important to keep in mind. And perhaps that disconnection from our own heritage is, you know, also another loss, right? That we're,
It's a
you know,
huge loss.
that as a professional, to be honest, that I'm grieving. And I think that's why there's this initiative, and I'm very looking forward to the efforts of these young people who are now trying to reclaim that heritage, that really try to you know, and in a way Uyghurs did it in a beautiful way of fusion. So it wasn't like just Uyghur cultural heritage. It was, they, you know, connected with Chinese traditional medicine, they connected it with Islamic, you know, which comes from like kind of Greek medicine, and all of these things were formed together. And the human body was a very, very intelligent, knowing, acting agent. And so, but obviously very, very few people know that now, especially those who are in the diaspora, and especially the young people who are experiencing these traumas that is ongoing. So I guess my question to you then is, how do we you know, begin that process of first recognizing that we're grieving, and perhaps after that recognition, why is it that it's so scary for people to start that journey, right? What is the obstacle, the block that prevents someone from, you know, going to intend to feel better?
Okay, I think those are great questions. And I want to just start with something you were saying about the body, which is I think that our bodies have ways in of themselves to naturally do things, and our culture at times stops us, so that sometimes we're told don't cry, or don't don't say how you feel because this or that or the other, and kind of stops our bodies from doing what it would do to naturally heal.
Right.
So I think you asked why is this also hard to do? I think there are probably some ideas that it's hard to people to accept, and maybe it's because of the clashing cultures and all. But part of it is everything in life changes and ends. Things do not always go according to the plan we have. Life is not always fair. Pain is part of life. And I think accepting those things is very difficult. And so sometimes I think we're fighting against grieving because we don't want to accept any of those things. We don't want to accept, for example, that someone we love is going to die, or we don't want to accept that there may be something that can happen that in general, we don't want to happen. We don't want to accept that we lost this job. We don't want to accept certain things and deal with them. And by not dealing with these things, because we don't wish for them to happen, I think it causes us more grief and more suffering. I think we sometimes wish that we had more control over how this world would be. That we wish we could make it exactly the way we want it to be. And I think that in reality, many things happen that aren't the way we may want it to be, but this is the way the world is created and the way life is, always changing, things happening, many things. There are certain things in our control, but there are many things that are beyond our control. Whether we feel it's nature or God, we feel there are things that are just not in our control.
That is very, very beautiful. It reminded me of, this kind of central concept that is actually at the core of Islam, which majority of Uyghurs are, and that is submission. And I remember one of my teachers, the idea that most of life's problem come because we are unwilling to submit to the will of God, right? And I think this, and I like the word acceptance. I also like the word willingness, right? And I think there's this this idea that yes, we are facing as a community all of this oppression, but at the same time, accepting that reality, can we move forward for what we value? And are we willing to, despite all of the loss and grief and even the grieving that is ongoing, that we're continuing to experience, and the additional losses that we're continuing to experience, are we willing to move forward? And I think that part of core, that just reminded me of that core value in Islam, which is tawakkul, which means essentially this God, complete reliance upon God in devising your life, right? And in not, that doesn't necessarily mean oppression is good. Of course not. We, whenever we see oppression, we need to uplift it, like remove it. That's the first thing. Any harm must be removed first. But there's this idea that we cannot equate God's command or God's will with God's love. God loves justice and God loves, mercy and good deeds and these things. God does not love tyranny and oppression, but God can will that, right? For with the wisdom that he has. And at least that's the central kind of tenet of our kind of creed, that we have that belief that God can do whatever he wants. And but there's wisdom in that, and we're willing to move forward in life with that.
So this is very beautiful teaching. What I want to say is that my experience is that for some of the people I've worked with who are Uyghur, they feel, as you are describing, a very deep belief in these concepts and in this view. And there are many others for whom, although their parents may have had this belief, this doesn't hold the same doesn't have the same hold as it seems to
Mm.
have the way you describe it. And so I think it's important that for each person, they find the way to move through this in the way that speaks to them at this time in their existence and in their lives. And I think these things about the way it is, whether one believes this is God's will or some other idea of how the world is, other ways to look at it would be if we just look at nature and change. The seasons are always changing. Flowers are beautiful, they grow and then they die. People, they start a beautiful little baby and they grow and grow, and there's always change, and eventually there's death. That these cycles and change can be part of understood within Islam and within an Islamic view, and also within many different philosophical ways of viewing the world and the way we are always changing. And I think the question is, what can we do with this change? Sometimes we can pay attention and love it and accept it, but how can we move towards moving through and accepting the changes, whether they're ones that we want or not, whether they're ones we feel that God has ordained for us, or we just feel this is somehow the life we're in, however we got here. And I think that ends up being a very big question. What do we do with all of this? And I would say one of the first things is to notice that we have a lot of feelings about what's going on, and that any feelings we have are okay. I found that sometimes some of the people I've talked to feel like certain feelings are not okay, that you're not supposed to feel a certain way. And what I notice is the best way to kind of is that feelings are just what are inside you, and that as you allow yourself to feel them, think about them, understand why you're feeling that way, sometimes the feeling will move or change. The feeling may not always stay there. And so sometimes the easiest way for a feeling to lift is if you kind of embrace it first. If you say, I'm feeling really sad, I don't like feeling sad, but I am feeling sad, and why I'm feeling sad, and embracing it and expressing it, and maybe talking to someone about it and loving it, and then it may leave some. It may not have to stay with you always if you can love it in some way or accept it, even if you don't love it. And that could be fear, anger, sadness, relief at something.
Yeah, this reminds me of this kind of concept of secondary emotions and primary emotions. And we talk about how, we have, for example, you might feel anger, but beneath that is a need that's unmet, and that might be sadness and pain that's unspoken, right? And similarly, someone might be having erratic behaviors that actually might be pointing to some kind of a deeper loss that is there. And so there's that aspect. So obviously you cannot go deeper unless you acknowledge the surface level emotion, right? And then you can kind of, like as you were saying, go through that journey of understanding your own emotions. And I think another thing I do see in my community, in this Uyghur community here, especially I would say amongst maybe the younger generation, but also the more older generation who came long ago, is this almost like desperate need to want to control their feelings, right? So they spend so much energy, or we spend so much energy trying to control all of our time. For example, if someone is feeling a lot of sadness, then we spend so much dedication to like medication, our energy, all of those things, like to get rid of that sadness. So the idea is to get rid of it because we do not like it, but that's actually and neglecting what's happening around you, which is there are people around you who love you, or there's a community who can support you. There might be other people there who are right next to you who can support you, that they don't know how to support you because they're not talking, you're not telling them anything, right? So there's a lot, and there might be other things. You might have a job, you might have a family, you have the support, but all of these related factors are suffering because we're spending so much of our energy on trying to get rid of our feelings, and try to control them, rather than what you were mentioning, this idea that we acknowledge that they're there, we accept, or we're willing to move forward with life and act in a way on things that we value, and truly embrace those things that we really value, despite everything else that's happening. Now, that doesn't mean you ignore them, but you process them in this journey that you were mentioning. So in that processing step, so if we can move into, okay, so what are some things, what are some strategies, in different dimensions, I guess, according to people's level of grief, that people can employ and start to kind of move through this process of processing grief?
Okay. I think I would start with the idea, and some of them you mentioned in certain ways, 5 letters F, faith. I think for many people, for those for whom that works, faith can be a way of processing grief, partly because of the ideas and partly because of the community, and partly because being amongst people who share ideas about loss and grieving and are there to be with them, to stay with them. So that's one. Family and friends. So faith, family, friends. Generally, now one of the issues here is many people are far from their families. And so that can be a source of grief, is not being, not having the family, not having access to their family. But many people I know here have also made friends into family. That if your family is far away, people have created family out of friends who are here, who understand you. And I think that in general, Uyghurs that I've met have a great deal of hospitality, love to have people over, love to share meals together. And I think they love to do that, but it's important to love to be the one who allows other people to take care of you, who you're not always the host taking care of others, but allowing these family and friends to take care of you in this time of grieving. That people will eat with you, will invite you over, will listen to you, will talk to you. I think there's also a fear that you were saying before, that perhaps it's burdening people if you let them know what you're feeling. What my guess is actually many of the people who are your friends, whether in the Uyghur community or even outside, often feel, within the Uyghur community, often feel many of the same things you're feeling, and often will feel a sense of bonding to knowing what you're feeling and to the fact that you open up to talk to someone. There's many studies that show that people feel closer when you open up to tell them how you're feeling, and sometimes they may share the feelings too that you have. I think another of the S, besides faith, family, friends, we talked about feelings, is also, I wrote forests. What do I mean by forests? I mean being in nature. Being in nature is often very healing for people. There's something called actually forest bathing, which is even to the idea is to walk through a place of nature, literally a forest, but it could be a garden. It could be your backyard. It could be a park. That somehow being amongst nature is very healing to people, to either be at one with nature because of your belief in how nature was created, or at one just because there are ways that nature is calming, or because nature also teaches us that things keep changing, but they continue. that the leaves fall in the autumn, but in the spring there will be more leaves. That life goes on, even though there's death and ends, there's new beginnings and new things that keep coming. And finally, in nature, we learn about the interdependence. Here in America, people often like to be independent. I can do this myself. It's weak if I depend on someone else. While nature and grieving often needs other people. And in nature, there's all kinds of things of showing how for a tree to grow, it also needs sunlight, it needs the rain, it depends on what's happening in the earth. It might need birds to come to pollinate something. There's all kinds of things that are all working together. And I think nature teaches us that we all need one another, that we're not just alone standing out there, but that we need one another. And being in nature helps us to understand how important it is to be with other people and that we all help each other in many ways.
That is very, very beautiful. And it reminds me that, a couple of times from different people I've heard, Uyghurs who actually grew up in East Turkestan, they would say anywhere they look, no matter, if that's the mountains of Switzerland or, the lakes, they are reminded of their homeland, right? So this kind of concept that when you're connecting and when you're actually truly being in that space, you're absorbed in, and in a way that reminiscence is part of that healing journey, right? And again, we're trying to not control or get rid of our thoughts, right? We're trying to really embrace and process them and remember the good and kind of move forward in the process. And I think so these are all I would say quite obvious cases of grief and loss, obviously losing people that you're close to, and that takes, like you said, that hole will always be there. And there's this kind of very famous saying that the wound is where the light goes in, right? And there's this idea that every one of these losses are meant to actually make us, that's already researched in post-traumatic growth literature, and I truly see them, those who really go through the process of healing and embrace this grieving journey, they do become the most helpful and productive people of society, and they really try to help others as well. And I see that within our Uyghur community, as well as other communities who have been traumatized through the ages. So now, how do we, if I may flip the question or the scenario, there are also people who are grieving they might think that their grief is not worth grieving for, right? I'm not sure if so for example, especially the young people, those who have never been to East Turkestan, those who are grown or born in America, let's say, and they share this grief from their parents, and they might not have, but they don't really quite understand it in that fully, experiential sense. So, but at the same time, they're grieving a people, a land that they've never seen, and a community that they never, but they're oftentimes brought up in this society in a sense of like, this is your identity and this is what you will fight for the rest of your life. So there is a lot of grief happening there. Actually, they might be grieving their childhood, they might be grieving a normal teenage or childhood experience of being an American child, or whatever it is. There's so many things that are happening. They might be grieving having non-grieving parents. Like, there, you see, there's a lot is there. So how can we then address that intergenerational perhaps grief that is almost a aftermath of what is happening now?
And I think this is a really important question you're asking. And I think especially for the second and third generation, this intergenerational grief is a very real thing. When you're saying sometimes people feel like maybe the grief isn't real enough or big enough, whatever anyone is feeling, is big enough and real enough. There's no competition or comparison when it comes to loss and grief. You know, for a small child, a goldfish that dies may be the most terrible grief ever. And I say that with all seriousness,
Yeah.
because it is for that child. What you're talking about, I think, has several different layers. One is, I think, and I think this is very often in the immigrant experience, that the parents have a certain idea of life, and the children growing up in the new country here in America are exposed to other things. And sometimes there's a conflict between whether it's belief systems, culture, what is the right way to be. And there's sometimes even a grief about, as you say, grieving not having the normal childhood that they see their friends having. As an example, for example, many of the Uyghur families I've dealt with, it appears the Uyghur parents are much more anxious about giving their children or teens freedom, let's say to go out. The parents are worried that the children might be kidnapped, or very fearful about these things, not only cultural things like maybe not wanting them to go to certain movies or things like that, but even just things like going to a friend's house for a sleepover. A parent might feel, this isn't right for my child. I either don't think it's safe or I don't think it's a good idea. And then there's tension between the parent and child, and the grief. The child may feel conflicted. I want to be a good child. I want to do what my parents want, but I don't like what's happening. That's one whole level. Another whole level is for the parents and maybe even the grandparents who have been through so much and lost so much. These things are transmitted to children, whether they're talked about or whether they're not talked about. And I think sometimes this second and third generation feel a burden, feel a sorrow, feel something is missing or something is wrong, sometimes not sure what it is, sometimes feeling the pain and suffering that a parent feels, even if some parents may speak of all the losses that they have, and the child feels that burden and somehow feels they should do something and either feel that same burden or maybe want to get rid of that burden or aren't sure what to do. But sometimes a child feels sad and at a loss and not even sure what they're sad about. Or sometimes feel they're supposed to be sad about East Turkestan, but they've never been there. And maybe for some people, they feel this great love for it. And for others, it may be like anxiety and guilt of not feeling so connected or the great love. And I think this is a very, very big issue, particularly for younger people, very big, and sometimes leads to feelings of guilt and a kind of vague unease. Or a vague sadness, and not really clear sometimes what it's about.
Yeah, and as you're speaking, I'm already like thinking about many scenarios and personal examples that I've seen in the community that is as such. And earlier, just the first thing that you mentioned about a child could lose a goldfish, and that is very important. I smiled because it reminded me of this beautiful incident in historical that in the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He once saw a young child, a boy, and he was crying and he was weeping. And so he went and he like put his blessed hand on his head and just kind of stroked it and said, what's wrong? Right? And the reason was that because the bird his bird has died. And so, but that gentleness and that care right, of a prophet illustrating this and modeling this for his community, which is, for those who follow that faith, is us, even to this day, is this beautiful gentleness and embrace of grief, and truly processing that in the most kind of healthy and wholesome way, right? With community, with care, with love, and there's this a lot of, especially in the topic of sadness and loss. I feel that the men across all culture, many cultures,
Many cultures, yeah.
definitely also in the Uyghur culture, they feel this sense of not being able to voice their loss, right? And perhaps voicing it is not that important, but even just processing it, even just acknowledging that this is part of their, what is inside them. So can you speak a little bit about that?
Yes, I will, about men's roles in a minute, but I'm going to say also, I think one of the things, for example, and I love the story of the bird and the prophet, is in terms of the child with the bird or the goldfish, sometimes the older generation feels like they've been through such trauma that it's hard for them. They're like, you can't be upset about a goldfish. You don't really know how terrible things have been. And that in itself can be so harmful to the child who grows up feeling that they shouldn't have feelings of loss about what you before called little things. But of course, all of us do have those feelings. And so sometimes part of the intergenerational trauma is the generation who, let's say, were tortured in some way or separated in some horrible way, have trouble allowing the younger generation to experience smaller traumas as loss because some of the parents are stuck in these larger traumas. Okay, the role of men, particularly in the Uyghur culture, it appears that although both women and men are very strong characters for sure, and both are very bright and wise in many ways, there seems to have been a cultural idea of the men not being able to express their feelings as much. Although I will say, in people I've worked with, there are men who are very empathic and kind and caring. But the traditional idea is that in the family, they seem to be more rule makers and less able to allow themselves to access their feelings of loss and grief. I think there's been a tremendous burden put on them to somehow not be able to express these feelings.
Yeah, and again, pure expression is not what we're calling for, right? And I think part of that is acknowledgement, and simply understanding and processing for yourself. Now, we've talked a lot about, even the 5 Fs that you mentioned. These are all strategies that we can, install in our daily kind of activities, and as much as we can, to seek that support that's around us, or if we don't see support, create that support network or be support for someone else, and in doing so, gaining support from someone else, being that mirror for each other, right, in that community of grief. But at the same time, there is this, extreme cases, I would say, maybe not even extreme, but quite
Not
severe
even
cases.
extreme. Yes.
Yeah, quite severe cases, or cases that require serious professional attention, that are being neglected, and perhaps as a reason, as a cause of what you were mentioning now, of this idea that, well, there are people being tortured. What I'm feeling is nothing, right? I shouldn't feel, why am I feeling so sad when my friend has lost their parents, right? So this kind of relative, and to be honest, we see that a lot, as the trauma is ongoing with all of the world events that are happening around us. So can you speak a little bit about that, and how do we then, in such a case, like, first of all, how do we notice, where's the line when we notice that, well, maybe we should seek professional attention, and of course we have, the Uyghur Wellness Initiative here, that is, as part of ongoing efforts or resources to provide that support. But yeah, so I just wanted to hear from you in kind of
okay. Those are such good questions. I feel like so many things to say. Before I specifically get to that, I also want to say some additional things that I hadn't even said before that apply to this, but even more. Besides the things I said, there's also things like music, especially people of Uyghur music or any other music, listening to music, playing an instrument, reading poetry, writing poetry, engaging in your creativity to express what's going on, drawing, painting, photography, writing down what's going on for you. And then two other things, and then I'm going to get to this other. It's one thing, well, is both the issues also of gratitude and loving kindness, that those are also ways to help people through grief, is both understanding what's lost and gratitude for what was and for perhaps what will be. I'm not saying these are easy, but they're things that help people, even small gratitudes for seeing the sun or the moon. And also loving kindness and compassion to oneself. Often when people, to oneself and to others. So often when people are in a state of grief, whether it's men or women, are often like, I shouldn't feel this way, or it's too long, or I shouldn't feel this way either because I don't feel enough or because I feel too much. And there's a way that it is helpful for people to be able to feel loving kindness to themselves. Breathing, being able to breathe is one of the main things. We all, part of life is breathing, and being able to practice deep breaths and relaxation and breathing, to breathe in, to feel one's heart, to hear one's breath, and to be able to wish for oneself while in grief, to be able to say to oneself, may I feel love, may I feel joy, may I feel safe, may I feel peace, to be able to try and move into that realm. Now, Zuly, you were asking me, there are times, and I'm not going to call it extreme, but sometimes we notice that time has gone on, but what are some of the times? I would say, first of all, anytime if you feel that you would like to speak to someone about what you're feeling, you're not feeling right, you can always get in touch with the Uyghur Wellness Initiative and see if there's somebody whom you can speak with. But the kinds of things where I would encourage you to do so, even if you hadn't been thinking of speaking to someone, one is if you're having trouble regularly getting up in the morning, you have trouble getting out of bed, you're having trouble eating, you're having trouble finding clean clothes to wear. If you're having trouble, not once or twice, but you can't seem to focus at all on your work. If you're having thoughts of somehow life is not worth it anymore in any way, that you might want to, you imagine hurting yourself in some way, that it feels to you that it's too much. In that last case, you absolutely need to get in touch either with the Uyghur Wellness Initiative, with friends, with family, or even to call 911 if you're feeling very distressed in that way. What kinds of things can people do to help you? The main thing is being there with you. And you might think, well, how can anybody help me because they can't make any of these losses go away? But you might be surprised, someone listening to you, someone being there with you, someone helping you understand what's going on. These things can be really helpful, helping you find ways to move through this journey. It's a journey. It's not on or off. It's not one step. It's a journey. And therapists, psychologists, social workers, psychiatrists are trained to help people on the journey because, believe it or not, besides our having the ability to be sad and to be depressed, we also have the ability to heal. we also have the ability to move forward even when it doesn't feel like it. People speak a lot about about trauma, about traumatic stress, traumatic events in people's lives, but there's also astonishing growth that's possible. It's true, and I know Zuly was saying before, that often when people go through this journey, they are able afterwards to show extraordinary growth and extraordinary empathy for other people and their suffering, and find out things about life that maybe they didn't know before, but they learn as they learn to live differently than the way they were before.
There's very, very important pointers there, and I think those symptoms are truly severe in the sense that yes, we should always try to be, even to get to that level is first being aware of how we're feeling, right? And then I think that's the first step that I see a lot of people neglecting, is knowing what they're even feeling. I've had people who told me that, I just cry sometimes and I don't know why I'm crying, right? And so that's a big sign that there's something there. But the thing is, you see so many things happening that you almost always neglect that, right? Well, I don't know why I'm crying. I'm just probably feeling moody today. Especially women would
Mhm.
really neglect this, right? They tend to, either blame it on their period or blame it on whatever. They just tend to just move forward. And I think, changes in personality is another big thing that we observe, especially around for younger people as well, as they go through this process. And I think a lot of what we discussed related to grief and loss, there's a lot of comorbid symptoms with depression, anxiety, and so there might be, all of these are working together. So it's, you don't have to address, I have to get rid of my depression, then everything will be fine. Well, maybe there's something else, right? And so I think what you said about seeking support, that is the number one. Loneliness is an epidemic, as we discussed, I think in previous talks, and and I think astonishingly, Uyghur community, I've noticed, is a community that is, of course, very much together because of this trauma and the oppression that we're facing, but almost always very isolated as well. And there's this sense of, well, it's either or, black and white all the time, right? And so we need to seek that support with each other and also outside of ourselves. And that's why I love what Uyghur um, wellness initiative is doing, and so trying to help get support for people. And there are similar programs in Turkey for those who are non-English speakers. We have counselors, and there's a couple of new counselors that I know that are being trained, who are Uyghur and Uyghur speaking. So if that's a barrier to entry, of course, hopefully, God willing, we have more resources upcoming. But I think as long as there's a will, there's a way, as they say. So
I'm going to say two other things that just came to my mind when you were talking also, that sometimes, although people don't like to think of it in the Uyghur community, sometimes when people are overcome, they turn to alcohol and excessive alcohol use. Drugs are also something, although again, people don't like to imagine that it's in the Uyghur community, it exists. The use of drugs, the overuse of alcohol. Another sign is any kind of violence in the home. Is something that suggests something is very wrong, that there's a very serious problem that has to be addressed immediately. And the other thing I'm going to say, which is important, is that I've talked with people that there's sometimes a sense of shame. And the main shame is that I think, at least in the past, I'm going to say, and maybe in the present, that there was a sense that seeking any kind of counseling at all meant that somebody was crazy or just hopeless or a failure. And I think that is shifting. and that the sense of shame sometimes keeps people from either seeking help or from even noticing that something is really wrong.
Yes, the stigma that you mentioned is a major issue, obstacle that I think actually that is the barrier to entry for most people to seek help. And like you said, I myself, as have worked in this community, I'm seeing that shift being and this kind of concept being dismantled through these kind of talks, right? And to be honest, one of the first things that I mention to someone who comes to me with any form of issue is this in itself took bravery, is very, very brave, highly intelligent, for you to want to be better, because no one around you will benefit from you. You cannot help anyone if you cannot help yourself. And in fact, this is also, for those who are religious, the key center of faith. In our faith, it's in the Quran. God says he will not change anything in you unless you change yourself, right? So there's this willingness, again, this concept of acceptance and willingness to move forward, and wanting to be better, and seeking those methods. It's not just an intention carries a long way, of course, that's first, but actually taking the steps, seeking help within the community. And alhamdulillah, like, we are blessed with a lot of opportunities through these initiatives and platforms like this, and community, people like you who are willing to give their time to really help the community move forward. And I do say community because truly, when it's a humanity, right? As if one person, if you can save one person, it's like you've saved all of humanity. And so it's a very beautiful thing that we're doing. And the same thing we should think for ourselves. If I can save myself, I'm saving a whole of community, right? The entire humanity as we see. So that is, at least for me, that's the major motivation. Awesome. I think we are very short on time. This was a really engaging conversation for me. I've actually definitely learned a lot. Do you have anything that last few words that you would like to kind of give, and a message that you would like to give to the community before we close?
Yes, I think that sometimes people worry, besides the issue of shame, that somehow their problems aren't big enough. They weren't tortured like their parents or whatever. And I would say that when a person is suffering inside, they affect not only themselves, they affect their family. If they're in a relationship, they affect their spouse. If they have children, it affects their children. So that the best thing you can do, both for yourself, but for your friends and your family around you, is to seek help when you need it. That there is nothing that is too small or too unimportant. Your life is important, and who you are, you affect all the people in the world around you. And it matters, and you matter. You count very much. And I think I would, maybe we can say more, but I would end with, I hope, may we all of us, may we be able to come to a point where we all are able to feel love and give love. May we all feel joy and provide joy to others. May we all feel safe and provide safety for others. May we be able to feel peace and provide a sense of peace to others also.
I mean, alhamdulillah. So awesome. That's a beautiful message, and I truly hope for your wish to come true, and I think we're moving towards that every day. Wonderful. I think we are out of time. So I believe that on the chat are the information for how to get in touch with Uyghur Wellness Initiative and UHRP is there. So any resources that you can locate there is definitely can be helpful. I believe also our Dr. Nechama and myself were also allowed, feel free to contact us if you have any questions specifically related to us that cannot be, addressed through other means. And I believe, yes, that Uyghur Wellness Initiative information is also there. So at this time, if there's any questions, we're happy to take questions, but I believe we don't have. So we don't have much time either. But please contact us for any questions. Thank you, Dr. Nechama.
That's what I was just about to interrupt you to say. Thank you, Zuly. It's a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your kindness. And I hope that tonight that this, I want to thank all the people who were on tonight and hope that this was of some help to everybody.
Thank you so much. All of those back to you. Wonderful.